This is the MMA Brief Podcast, recapping the world of mixed martial arts every single week, with your host, Brandon Johansson.
Welcome to the MMA Brief Podcast. Back recapping another exciting weekend of fights, UFC 204 in the books, and let's get right into it. First fight of the night on the Fight Pass prelims went to a split decision. What else do you need to know? Second fight, Mike Perry, making his second UFC appearance, had a brutal knockout of Danny Roberts. A vicious knee pretty much ended it, and then he continued to beat the life out of him. Late stoppage by referee Mark Goddard. On the first fight of the FS1 prelims, Mark DeCasey scored a TKO in the second round, followed by Leon Edwards getting the upset rear naked choke finish of Albert Tumanov. The next fight was at bantamweight between Damian Stasiak and Davey Grant, and that fight ended by armbar in the third round. And the FS1 feature prelim bout, Yuri Alcantara versus Brad One Punch Pickett, ended in the first round at 2 minutes, with Alcantara scoring the submission via triangle choke of Brad One Punch Pickett. Pickett, of course, fighting in front of his hometown crowd, not the best showing for him. Pay-per-view started off with Mirsad Bektic fighting Russell Doan. Doan, of course, a very late replacement, and he got submitted in the first round with a rear naked choke. The next fight was Stefan Struve fighting Daniel Emelianenko. Stefan Struve getting the Darce choke submission finish in the second round. The third fight from the main event, Jimmy Manuwa faced off against Ovince St. Preux, scoring the upset knockout of OSP. Ovince St. Preux, of course, coming off of his very impressive performance against John Bones Jones, arguably the greatest fighter to have ever done it. OSP lasted the entire 5 rounds with Jones and, even knocked a giant booger out of John Jones's nose. That's the ultimate slobber knocker. If I've ever seen one, OSP landed it on John Jones. He lost the decision, but it was a very encouraging win. This one, however, very disappointing setback for OSP. He's got to go back to the drawing board now. He tried to utilize his wrestling in the first round. There was some good ground and grappling positions from him. Manuwa actually looked for a guillotine at one point, but the second round, Manuwa stunned him with a right hand, got him up against the cage, left hook, and OSP collapsed. His leg was pinned behind his body. It was a nasty knockout. And Jimmy Manuwa now thrust himself into some sort of relevancy in that division where he's always kind of underachieved. Everyone thought he was going to be very good, but he's always had tough matchups, The Gustafsson fight early on in his UFC career was tough. Gustafsson ran right through him. I believe he was the first person to stop Jimmy Manuwa. Now, coming off that performance over a guy who went 25 minutes with John Jones, sky's the limit for Jimmy Manuwa. We've always known he has the striking potential to be a real threat. It was his signature knockout so far in the UFC. Co-main event, Gegard Mousasi fighting Vitor Belfort. And before I go any further, Vitor, obviously, if you don't know the story, was on testosterone replacement therapy, which was 100% legal. It was authorized by his doctor. So he was getting synthetic testosterone just a couple years ago, and he was so jacked. He looked inflated compared to his body now, where TRT, or testosterone replacement therapy, has now been outlawed in MMA. He looks like a different person. He looks, I say this with all respect, flabbier and softer than he did just 2 years ago when he looked like a basketball. He was so inflated, and he was running through everyone. He had just incredible knockouts, just a crazy, memorable streak he went on, defeating the likes of the current middleweight champion, Michael Bisping, the former middleweight champion, Luke Rockhold, both by head kick. He knocked out Dan Henderson, the title challenger of UFC 204. He was knocking everybody out with head kicks. It was like this crazy thing. Joe Silva, the UFC matchmaker, made the joke that he downloaded a black belt. I mean, that's how crazy it was. Vitor always had great boxing, and he always had great jiu-jitsu. And then all of a sudden he's knocking everyone out with these very crisp, very technical kicking techniques. A crazy, awesome time period in the UFC when TRT Vitor was at his best. But Saturday was a different day. Vitor looked like a shell of himself. Gegard Mousasi landing with a head kick in the second round that stunned Vitor. He ended up throwing a flurry of uppercuts and eventually took the fight to the ground, mounted him, and pounded him out, TKO. This is the third time in the past 4 fights. All 3 of his losses, 3 out of 4 fights, have been by mounted ground and pound. Chris Weidman for the title, Gegard Mousasi obviously this past weekend, and Jacare Souza before that. Vitor, he doesn't look great physically. He hasn't looked great defensively from the mount position. You'd think that if you got pounded out one time even from the mount, you'd think, okay, how the hell do I negate this possibility in a fight? If someone mounts me, I need to learn the best mount recovery. In the Weidman fight, he was throwing punches off his back, throwing hammer fists from his back. He wasn't putting his hand on Weidman's hips. He wasn't trying to shrimp. I'm not trying to sound like I know too much, but Vitor should know better than what he was doing defensively from being mounted. I don't know if he's too proud. Sometimes guys are too proud. They don't want to put themselves in bad positions because they don't think that they'll be in those bad positions. It's silly. He really should invest a large majority of his camp figuring out, how do I get out of mount when I'm mounted? Or maybe he should hang it up. I don't know. He looked like a shell of his former self. Like I said, the TRT Vitor of just a couple years ago was a phenomenon. And his nickname just so happens to be the Phenom. He was incredible. We move on to the main event. Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping in the rematch. 7 years in the making. Dan Henderson obviously knocking Michael Bisping out at UFC 100 in one of the most memorable, most devastating knockouts in UFC history. One punch. Also diving and dropping a forearm on his face, his unconscious body, making it even harder for them to resuscitate him. The point is, the rematch went down this past Saturday. It delivered 100%. Dan Henderson looked good in the first round. Bisping was the more active fighter, no doubt, until Dan Henderson lands a H-bomb from hell, dropping the champion. He rushes over, gets on top of him, beats him up with hammer fists and elbows that open up the nastiest cut under Michael Bisping's left eye, which Michael Bisping has a surgically repaired right eye. So now vision was becoming a concern right away. This cut was huge. Henderson looked and looked and looked, trying to get the finish. Did not get it. Bisping got to his feet. Last 10 seconds of the round, he threw a kick even after all that assault by Hendo. Round 2, Bisping came out very, very impressively, just right in Henderson's face, being very aggressive, throwing a lot of stuff. Now, in my opinion, a lot of what Bisping was throwing wasn't really landing. It was landing on the arms. It was barely even touching him. The strikes that Henderson landed were devastating. So later on in the second round, there's a questionable kick. Henderson grabs his groin and starts to backpedal. Referee does not stop it. Bisping chases after Henderson. He's trying to say, I got hit low. It was an illegal shot. The referee let it continue. Henderson cracks him with another H-bomb from hell. Drops Bisping for the second time in the fight. Second time in 2 rounds. And he swarms him again. He goes down to the ground. He starts doing some smothering. He puts his hand over Bisping's mouth and just kind of wrote it out. Bisping, at that point, I'm feeling 2 rounds heavy for Dan Henderson. Bisping goes on to high volume, like I said, nothing clobbering at all. I don't think Henderson was hurt one time in the fight. But Henderson wasn't producing enough offense in the 3rd and 4th round. So those easily, I believe, would go to Michael Bisping. I feel it's a 2-2 fight, 2 rounds apiece. We're going in the 5th and final. It was a groin strike, by the way. That questionable one right before the H-bomb in the 2nd round. It was a groin strike. Replay confirmed that. And then there was a groin strike again, I believe, in the 4th round. And Henderson took 3 out of the allowable 5 minutes to recover from that groin strike, because it was the second one. Like I said, at the time of the fight, it was in question, might have been a stinging body shot. That's happened before. Guys will get hurt with a body shot, and they will reach for their crotch and say, oh, I got hit low, to stop the action. There's no timeouts in fights. Upon replay, we saw that the first one, right before Henderson blasted him, was, in fact, low. He got hit again. He took a lot of time to recover. And in the fifth round, I thought he came out. He looked very aggressive. He landed, like I said, more thudding, more authoritative punches, where Bisping was just kind of touching him. Like I said, I don't believe Bisping ever hurt him. And Bisping was hurt multiple occasions. Henderson ended up getting a takedown in the fifth round, hoping for a decision, but I was cautiously optimistic because it was in Manchester, England, hometown of Michael Bisping. Decision came out 48-47, 48-47, 49-46, all Bisping. Disappointed that Dan Henderson didn't get to end his career with that accomplishment of being UFC champion. He came so close. He almost beat the champion at 46 years of age. But a lot of fighters reached out on Twitter after the fight. They were feeling very inspired. Nate Diaz tweeted, "Henderson's a G," with 100% an American flag emoji. Dana White tweeted, "Henderson is made out of leather and rock." Former middleweight champion Chris Weidman did not like the decision, and he tweeted, "Don't like that decision." Lots of other fighters thanked Henderson for his historic career. Former middleweight king Luke Rockhold tweeted, @DanHendo, "You are a warrior like none other. One of the greatest fighters this sport will ever know. Been an honor, my friend." End tweet. And UFC welterweight Jorge Masvidal tweeted, @DanHendo, "Best career ever. #UFC 204. Henderson and Bisping went on to win $50,000 Fight of the Night performance bonuses. Jimmy Manuwa earned a $50,000 performance of the night bonus with his knockout of Ovince St. Preux, that left hook in the second round. And like I said before, Yuri Alcantara won a performance of the night for his triangle choke submission of Brad One Punch Pickett. A lot of rumors swirling around right now in the world of MMA. But there's one thing that's certain before we get into the rumors. Conor McGregor has been fined $150,000 for his bottle and can throwing episode during a pre-fight press conference with Nate Diaz. That's a lot of coin for a professional fighter. Maybe not Conor, because he makes a lot more money than most fighters. However, for a normal fighter, that might be a couple years in the octagon. Some of these guys are getting paid $20 to show, $20 to win, so $40 total after you pay all your expenses and stuff, and you're only fighting every 3 months. They're really not making a lot of money. So $150,000 to an average fighter would cripple them. To Conor McGregor, I think he'll be okay. The rumors I was talking about, the big one, George St. Pierre versus Anderson fucking Silva, UFC 206 in Toronto, the card that's going to be headlined by Daniel Cormier and Anthony Rumble Johnson, light heavyweight title. A rematch, of course. Anthony Rumble Johnson cracked Daniel Cormier in their first fight in the first round. Cormier almost face planted, but was able to recover and eventually wear down Rumble Johnson and submit him with the rear naked choke in the third round to capture the light heavyweight title. Like I said, George St. Pierre, Anderson Silva. This is a fight that's been talked about for years. At one point, everyone thought it was going to go down at Dallas Cowboys Stadium. It's just never happened. It's never came to fruition. George St. Pierre has been out of business now for almost 3 years. He retired the champion. It was a controversial decision that he retained his belt against Johnny Hendricks. Johnny Hendricks beat the fuck out of him. He looked like Michael Bisping looked after the Dan Henderson fight. It's a pretty good comparison. The Henderson fight versus Bisping and Hendricks versus GSP. Well, GSP retired after he got the gift from God and got his decision when he should have lost his belt to Hendricks, in my opinion. Hendricks went on to win the belt anyway. It doesn't really matter. George St. Pierre never lost his title. He's coming back against Anderson Silva, who has lost 4 fights since then. He got knocked out when he was clowning around against Chris Weidman. In their rematch, he broke his leg when Weidman checked a kick perfectly. He should have lost to Nick Diaz, I thought. He also lost to Michael Bisping, the middleweight champion, and he lost to Daniel Cormier, the light heavyweight champion. So it's not like he has been fighting Joes or anything. He's been fighting tough competition, but Anderson Silva's legacy has taken a hit after the knockout loss to Weidman, the broken leg and long recovery in their rematch, losing a fight to Michael Bisping, which years ago it was laughable who would win a fight against Anderson Silva versus Michael Bisping. It was laughable. You would say Anderson Silva would take him out. At least I thought, anyway. Maybe I'm wrong. Bisping's clearly proved me wrong, because in that fight, he came back just like he came back in this Henderson fight. Henderson had him hurt very badly twice. In that Anderson Silva fight, Anderson Silva hit him with a flying knee, and he was truly compromised. Bisping was down. It looked like he was almost out. The only thing that saved him was Anderson Silva jumped on top of the cage and declared himself the winner. And Herb Dean, the referee, said, "Dude, I'm not calling the fight. Get down here and fight." By that time, Bisping recovered, and that's what I guess I'm so impressed with Bisping, is his recoverability, his heart, even though he took beatings, takes large shots, and should be just, should be over, like in the Silva fight, like I was hoping the 2 times in the Henderson fight. But he fought back and ended up getting the decision against Silva and Henderson. So GSP versus Anderson Silva, it's definitely just a rumor at this point. But it makes a lot of sense because it's in Toronto. George, obviously, being from Canada, would love to fight in front of his countrymen. And everyone's wanted to see that fight for years. Another rumor is Ronda Rousey is making her much-anticipated return, getting an immediate title shot against Amanda Nunes. Amanda Nunes is the women's bantamweight champion. Ronda Rousey was the first UFC women's bantamweight champion. Ronda has not fought since her vicious head kick knockout loss to Holly Holm in Australia back in November of 2015. So everyone's been anticipating her return, and now she might get an immediate title shot. It's a rumor. The fight might go down December 30th. I don't know. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Brandon Johansson, and I'll see you next week around the same time, recapping fights.